I've met some fantastic people as a socialist activist. It's one of the best things about it. But to be sharing a panel with Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell and Clive Lewis, three of the warmest, most generous, good-humoured people I've ever met, that's got to be a highlight. But what I'm really looking forward to about this panel is what makes it so interesting is their honesty. So these are people who are not afraid to say what they mean. Clive is famous for being outspoken, in and out of shadow cabinet for airing his views. John's speech, where he was talking about swimming through sick in Parliament, that's still one of the best I've ever heard. And then we've got Jeremy, who is someone who said what everybody had been thinking for years, and that's what propelled him to the Labour leadership. So this is going to be a guided discussion. It's not going to be a Q&A. But we want to talk about power, about taking its importance, how it relates to our values. Because we know that we lost in 2019, but this is just a different phase of the struggle. The problems haven't gone away. The huge upsurge when Jeremy made the ballot was because Jeremy articulated what millions of us felt. And Jeremy and John and Clive and all of us slayed this myth that it was socialist policies that were unelectable. We faced the worst recession ever. We have a climate crisis. We have middle managers now applying for universal credit, people in massive debt, people only homeless, not homeless because there's been a stay on evictions. The neoliberal capitalist system cannot solve the problems we're facing. So I'm going to draw out a few questions, but this is about winning. It's about identifying the real enemies, because the real enemies are certainly not the centrists and the Labour right, not even the Tories. The real enemies are poverty and climate breakdown and violent crime and war, the things that destroy lives, and they are systemic problems. And yes, there are actors who perpetrate them, but ultimately it's an economic and social system, the framework that enables them. So we'll cover a little bit about what needs to happen to keep Labour socialist, how we develop organisations and get socialist candidates in place, what we need to do to make socialism popular, to get into government, how we keep the debate focused on bread and butter and not culture wars and immigrant blaming, and how we acquire state power and what we do with it. So for purposes of continuity, I'm going to ask our panelists, just in 1 minute, a maximum of 1 minute, say something about the past few years. Generals are always fighting the last war. But if you have a look at the last few years, if we had to do it all again, what is one thing, just one thing, you would do differently? So if I can go to John first, please.
Thanks, Jamie, for that. Yeah, what I would do, Jamie, is drop you in it in the same way you just dropped me in it. Thank you very much. But the point about talking about what's happened in the past is not to reminisce or to even regret, to be honest. There's too much of that going on. It's about learning the lessons. And the issue for us, let's be honest, none of us, including me, expected Jeremy to win that first leadership election, did we? None of us. And I was the bloody chair of the campaign, and I didn't think we were going to win. So it was an act of real will to mobilise the campaign. And then when we won, we knew halfway through we were winning, and it was because of the ideas that Jeremy articulated, and he did it so well, took off, and it was a reflection of the movement. But the problem is that when you win a surprise election like that, you're almost cart before the horse. Well, we won an election, then we had to build the movement around it. When normally what you do, the old Gramsci thing, you hegemonize the debate, you win the argument, you build the movement, and then someone remind me who made that quote. I think it was Gramsci, who said, the election is just the final part of that stage of the campaign. So the issue for us now is that was forced upon us. It wasn't a choice. That's what happened. The lesson for us now is how do we build the party and trade unions as a social movement on a mass scale, so that when the left goes back, the radical social left goes back into leadership positions, which inevitably they will, that we've got that huge movement behind us. And actually it's happening. I'll shut up now, but it is happening. And what's so effervescent at the moment is on so many fronts. We've had a startling 10 months, lose the election, then into the pandemic. Then you've got Trump threatening, I think, the fabric of democracy, not just in America, but globally. But despite all of that, there's a real optimism and people are fighting back. So give examples, renters movement, renters union, Acorn, etc. Not just preventing evictions, but now challenging the whole concept of landlordism. New Black Lives Matters, magnificent, not just challenging racial injustice, but actually making us relearn our history about how power and resources and wealth was accumulated as a result of colonialism and slavery, and what does that mean in the modern world. But also what we're seeing now is, in terms of the trade union movement, particularly in the public services, the NHS, not just campaign for decent pay, proposing all privatisation, and now the development of a national social care service. So I think where we're at now is there's a social movements are establishing themselves on individual issues. Our role as socialists, how do we bring those together in solidarity, and how do we take the radical policies they're advocating, put that into an overall radical programme for change, and win the Labour Party to it? So in some ways, the lesson from the last time round is inevitably, it was forced upon us, we won before we built the mass social movement. Now we've got to build the mass social movement, and then that will take us, I think, inevitably back into power. Over a minute, Jake.
Yeah, so the one thing you change is all of it.
Yeah.
So, Jeremy, this was all done in your name. Now, we all know it wasn't you. You were part of a movement, and I think you were even perhaps more surprised than John to have won. But if there was one thing, looking back on it, that you could have changed, what would it have been?
Well, I'm not looking back, and I'm with Frank Sinatra where regrets are concerned, and I really enjoyed the early part of Gardner's question time on the call. So first of all, thanks to everyone for being on the call, and thanks, Jamie, for inviting me, and thanks for your solidarity over the time since you became the candidate for mayor and later on the election of mayor. I think the lessons of the past 5 years are the unbelievable power that the mainstream media have in this country to set a narrative, how difficult it is to challenge that narrative, and the levels of abuse that were heaped on individuals in our movement, absolutely unacceptable at any level. And whilst we use social media to try and counter that, it is not easy to do so. And that was one of the issues I've learned very strongly, that we need and must develop our own independent forms of communication. If you read the history of our movement, right from the 17th century onwards, there was always a determination to have an independent form of communication by pamphlets, newspapers, and we've somehow or other missed the point on that. And we now have social media, which lots of us use in lots of ways, but I think we need to build some reliable and good form of communication to reach our supporters and members, to keep them mobilized. The second point I'd make is that whilst we obviously lost the 2019 election, individually all of our policies were seen as very popular. Popular because they were rooted in our movement, they were rooted in the traditions of our movement and the life experience of many people. And I want us to not just keep policies, so I'm not interested in just defending the past, I'm interested in extending those issues, because the corona crisis has shown just how dangerous inequality is in our society, and globally just how dangerous it is to not to have universal health care. So my reflections so far are firstly on media, secondly on communications, which goes with that, but also that everything we said only 9 months ago, when I was being roundly condemned for spending too much money, for wanting a 4-day week, for wanting public ownership, and wanting, yes, and John proposed it, free access to broadband, all of which are now being proposed by a Tory government to cope with what was obviously unexpected corona crisis that has come along. So all our arguments have actually been proved to be absolutely correct. What I'd lastly say is that power is often seen in terms of holding of elected office. That is very, very important. I absolutely get that, because if you're in elected office, you're in a position to do things, such as the great things you're doing, Jamie, as mayor at the present time. But power is also the power of a movement to form opinion, the power of people to be part of that movement, and the power to change things. Everyone that's won a campaign to save a hospital, save a school, save a nursery, open a school, open a hospital, develop a new park, develop a community centre, get council housing built, is stronger as a result of it and achieves much more. And I think the lessons of Corona are a whole generation of people have suddenly realised the importance of their community and their lives within it, the vulnerable behaviour of the police in America, which is not new, has enhanced Black Lives Matter's movement, which is a very important movement for us to support and be part of, and involving people all around the world who see the treatment of black people in the USA, of black people in this country, of indigenous people in different parts of the world as part and parcel of the same thing. And I think we need to reflect on where power lies. Power lies wherever the movement is, and it's our job to strengthen that movement and revitalise it. And I can't wait for the days when we can return to meetings and rallies, but also retain the ability to bring in comrades who can't come to meetings and rallies for lots of reasons. So we have every meeting a joint effort between virtual media, such as we're adopting now, and the direct media of talking to each other in a park, in a hall, in a meeting room, or wherever else.
One of the challenges we faced for the last elections, the policies were very, very popular, as Jeremy said, as all of us on here have been articulating at various points. But we struggled in that election to get our arguments out, partly because of the media, but partly because the opponents managed to change it to be a Brexit war and a culture war. Do we need to broaden our message? You've spoken in the past about the Progressive Alliance. Jeremy was speaking there about the need to build a movement through victories. John was talking about bringing together all parts of our movement. What's your take on that, Clive?
First of all, thank you for inviting me onto this prestigious panel. It's probably the most prestigious one I've spoken on for some years now. I think, look, it's a really good question. And in terms of the one thing I'd change, and it does link into the secondary question you asked, is I would probably, when we were back at the beginning of Momentum's creation, we spent a lot of time umming and ahhing as to whether, and really thinking whether Momentum should be inside the Labour Party or outside of it. We decided it should be inside. I think that was a mistake. I think Momentum should have been outside the Labour Party, and I'll tell you why. The Labour Party has a very unique in European social democratic politics perspective on what it is to be a progressive. You can only be a genuine progressive if you are inside the Labour Party. If you're outside of it, the exception of trade unions who have a role in workplace organisation, if you're outside of it, you're not considered as a progressive, a genuine progressive. And I think this is problematic because if you talk about Black Lives, the Black Lives Matter movement, XR, Occupy, the Renters Union, I would say a majority of them have never been in the Labour Party and will never join the Labour Party. That is a reality of where movements are in this day and age. And I think until we grasp that, we will forever be sitting in an increasingly shrinking silo of which we will forever be on the back foot and facing defeat. And I think we have to understand that the 2019 election, you called it an election on which we had to fight on Brexit and the culture war. Brexit and the culture are one and the same. And unfortunately, that if you look at what's happened in Bernie Sanders' campaign and in what happened to the left under Jeremy and John, it's clear that mistakes have been made on both sides of the Atlantic. We can sit here and we no doubt will go over them, and we have gone over them ad nauseum. But there are also some structural issues. There's a reason why Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn both failed, and some of those are structural. And when you're trying to take on establishment, Republican Party or Conservative Party, the establishment economic, political giants of your nation state, one of the things that you need is you need to build an effective alliance. And unfortunately, what I would call the kind of technocratic centrists within our own party were, I think, opposed, the same in the US. And I also think in that electoral alliance, the other group that we found we have increasing difficulty with are what I would call the working class who have turned to authoritarian nationalism, are increasingly doing so, both in the US and the UK. And that is problematic. And until we can work within movements, both inside the Labour Party and outside of it, until we can reach out to many of those people who are in increasing numbers moving towards that authoritarian nationalism, I think we are going to fail to make up the critical numbers we need to get over the line in a hostile political environment, a hostile electoral system, which is heavily weighted towards the Conservative Party, has been since its inception, then I think that we will be on the back foot. So we're going to have to radically reassess what it is to be a movement, what it is to be a progressive, and who we are prepared to work with, given the cliff edge in terms of technology, in terms of the ecology, in terms of right-wing populism. We haven't got much space behind us. We need to start taking some steps forwards. And I think that means a complete reevaluation about who we consider to be progressive and broadening that out. It is uncomfortable. It is difficult. But until we do that, I think we will continue to repeat the mistakes that we have in the past.
I don't think it is uncomfortable. I really don't. It's the way, Clive, a lot of us have been working in that direction and in that form anyway. We've looked, especially when the left were relatively isolated in the Labour Party, we had to find allies wherever we could, you know. Sometimes people outside the Labour Party were more reassuring than some within at one point. In fact, you know, there was always that joke, and I spoke at Jeremy's 30th anniversary in Parliament, and I said that Jeremy was one of my closest friends in Parliament, and the response was, he's your only friend in Parliament.
I remember.
And so we've had to work beyond the movement. But the point I think you're making, which is really right, is I think we've got to recognise what we're up against now. Trump is a proto-fascist. Undoubtedly so. He has no respect for democratic institutions, convention, the truth, all those democratic values, no respect. Johnson is simply a buffed up upper class version of Trump with exactly the same disrespect for Parliament, for the courts, for all those democratic virtues. And I think both of them are willing to go to any extreme to retain power because they represent finance capital in particular to maintain that power. So I think we've got, and we have to be careful of the language that we use, and we shouldn't exaggerate. In the 1930s, the reason that fascism was successful is because the left and progressives, as you say, Clive, didn't recognize each other, didn't work together. Now, Harold Lasky said fascism in this country won't come with a marching dictator in a military uniform with medals, etc. But what could come is a sort of conservative or authoritarian that undermines our basic liberal democratic values. And I think that's where we're at them. I'm really worried about just how far right Trump and Johnson could go unless we defeat them. And to defeat them, there's got to be absolute unity. And that's why, in some respects, within the Labour Party as well, we will play from the left a constructive role. We're not going to be oppositionists for opposition's sake or anything like that, because we've got to try and win over the less elements within the Labour Party, particularly the Parliamentary Labour Party, to the serious nature of what we're in and the radical solutions that we need. But also outside the Labour Party, there's a huge vista now of people who are coming onto what we used to call terrain of struggle, coming onto that terrain that we've got to link up with and mobilise, actually listen to as well. Now, finish on this point, Jamie. One of our friends this week died, David Graeber. He was an anarchist, anthropologist, anarchist. He's one of the best writers I've read, and he was a good friend on the basis that he wasn't a party member, but he supported our administration. But actually, he's one of those academics who was in every struggle. And he turned up in my constituency. He was part of the occupations against the Third Runway as part of the climate change campaign. And there are people out there like that, I think, that are demonstrating that when an issue comes up, they're willing to mobilise and take action. And whether in the party or not, they're the people we've got to bring together and corral into a mass social movement. I'll shut up there.
No, John, is it okay, Jamie, if I just quickly come back very quickly on that? I think you're right, John. And when you gave that 30-year talk about Jeremy, it was before 2015, wasn't it? As I understand it, was it before?
Just about.
Just about, yeah. I think one of the things that's really interesting is outside of power, I think you yourself in particular have a track record of, and Jeremy as well, of working with others, a broader range of groups. But what it seems that becomes inherent is that once you move into the power structure of the Labour Party, it's very sclerotic. And I think there's an instinctive aversion to movements because they lack discipline and control. And the Labour Party they lack discipline, and Labour Party lacks the ability to control them. And there comes a conflict between winning an election and the movement building. And I think that's something that we've yet to come to grips with. I think when we're out of power, as we are now, we're very good at working with those movements and building. But once what we saw, once we came into power as the left, a lot of that basically fed away, and we focused very inwardly to the exclusion of many other movements. And I think I understand why, because you're under attack from elements within your own party. But I also think there's a historical tradition within the Labour Party, which is the belief that the only way that you will manifest socialism in this country is through the vehicle of the Labour Party and through an electoral route. And I buy into that as well. But however, I think that was a very much an approach which it didn't work that well in the past. And I certainly don't think it's going to work well now. But I think you're right. I think definitely movement building is the way we do that. But how do we then make sure that if we do come back into power in the next decade, how does the left ensure that those broader movements outside the Labour Party are part of the Labour movement?
It's true. If you've got,
could I just come in there? One point. What I was trying to do.
Can I make this point first? If I can make this point, otherwise I'll forget it. The issue for us was what you've got to guard against when you go into administration is bureaucratisation. You don't have to, read Trotsky, read Max Weber, whatever. And what happens is that you become bureaucratized. And it's the usual thing. The leader replaces the committee replaces the party replaces the people. It's that sort of thing. And that happened to us to a certain extent. And it happens in particular when you're under attack on an almost daily basis. Well, with us, it was hourly basis.
Hourly.
So what we've got to do is, in the discussion that we have for the future, is look at the democratic structures of the Labour Party to ensure that we guard against that bureaucratisation that inevitably takes place when you're in that sort of struggle. And that's one of the lessons. That's why, direct elections are so critical. And I think now, because we've seen, if the Labour Leaks report is accurate, because we've seen what the paid bureaucracy can do to lose us an election and work against us, we've got to look now at how we tackle the bureaucratic structures of the Labour Party. And again, I can't think of any other better way than direct election to enable us to overcome that. Sorry, Jeremy.
No, it's fine. Kind of add to that, really. In the 2015 leadership campaign, the whole point of it was to mobilise and empower people all across the country, and that brought hundreds of thousands of people into political activity, many of them for the first time. And I keep meeting people who say they came into political activity through that, and they've stayed in political activity in various forms: unions, Labour Party, community groups, tenants groups, all kinds of things. And that's what they're telling me all the time. What I was trying to do, what we're all trying to do, was to develop the Labour Party into a much more community-based organisation. That's why I was very keen on promoting community organisers. And as the leaked report has shown, there was massive opposition by certain people to the introduction of community organisers. And the point behind establishing Momentum was to ensure that there was a significant group as part of the Labour Party and Labour movement that was organising in communities around campaigns and food banks and empowering people, and also recognising that the levels of trade union membership are low across the whole country compared to what they were 20, 30, 40 years ago. and that in some parts of the country, the strength of unions based around one industry employer in various towns and cities is now massively reduced. Even places that have retained big industry, like steel, the numbers not working are very much smaller. Therefore, the number of union members is smaller. Therefore, the union influence on the entire community is smaller. So we do need to be mobilizing people in all the diversity of their employment to join unions, and particularly the self-employed and those working for very small and micro businesses, because that is where many people are now working. And I think it's our job as a movement to unite those people, organize with those people, and give some hope and solidarity, because as John has often pointed out, the tsunami of job cuts that's on the way, if local government isn't properly funded, if health isn't properly funded, and if there is a bad trade deal with the USA, and I can't think there's ever going to be a good trade deal with the USA, certainly under Trump, then the job threat is going to be absolutely enormous. So come only a few weeks or month or so away, this sort of thing is going to become absolutely center stage. And we need not just the party and unions doing things. What we actually need is local movements that feed into the idea of a national pressure. Power isn't just about the offices we hold, very important as that is, it's also about our presence and our pressure.
Can I ask a question, Jeremy? Would
Sure.
you agree? I think trade unions are critical. I mean, my dad worked for a trade union as a regional officer for 40 years of his life. And, you know, I've seen what they do day in, day out in terms of terms and conditions, workers' rights, representation, anti-racism,
Sure.
the works. And yet I also know the other side of that coin is that they are bureaucratic. I'm reading the GMB report at the moment. I mean, it's shocking reading that. But yeah, it's no surprise. And I look at Unison, I look at Unite, I look at the GMB, and these, yes, they've been under attack for 40 years, but it feels to me now, I haven't heard one trade union, one senior general secretary speak out about what's happening in the English Channel. Where is the commentary? So I guess the key thing I'm talking about here is that you look at the big trade unions and their structures, and I think that if we want people to join those trade unions, then they're going to have to be relevant to people's lives. They're going to have to adapt to a changing situation. And I think they need to democratize. They need to be more diverse. They are predominantly dominated by white men and older white men. And it feels to me that if we want those trade unions to be part of a modern, diverse ecosystem of movements, then they need to look like the people that they're representing as a start, but they also need to move away from their sclerotic bureaucratic structures, which I think are making them, adding to the struggle that they're already facing and that working people are facing. And this is a difficult conversation to have because there's enough Tories and businesses out there that want to kick trade unions, but we are the ones that have to have that conversation about their future, because if we don't, no one else will. Boris Johnson is interested in that. And I think the last thing to say in terms of our trade unions is I think there's something to be said for the new emerging trade unions, the IWGB and others, who are small, responsive, flexible. And it feels to me that it looks like the old energy systems of the 20th century. You know, the old big trade unions feel like the big coal-fired, gas-powered stations, when the future is networked, small, dynamic, responsive, and able to adapt quickly. And I think we need to have an honest conversation on the left about the future of trade unions and their role and structure. That GMB report is a fantastic opening for that conversation to take place, and I hope it does.
I think it's happened. I think it's happened. I was involved in the setting up of the IWGB here, and we were 2 years picketing outside of all places John Lewis, you know, supposedly a co-op. But if you look at what's happening in other unions, though, you know, Mark Sawatka on PCS, unbelievable campaigning union. In Hodgson, in terms of what's happening with regard to the Bakers Union, what they did in terms of the McDonald's strike and elsewhere. And what I was a member of NUPE, I was a shop steward for NUPE, and then we merged and became Unison. There's something about the big conglomerate organizations in our trade union movement where they're no longer particularly specialist and therefore can, not always, but can become distant from their members. And I think that debate's happening. And I think the election in Unison will, I think, demonstrate that debate. It's already demonstrated that debate. But you're
Can
right.
I just come in there? Following Clive and John's points, I too used to be a union organiser in Newpie, which is now part of Unison. And there were heroic attempts in Newpie in the 1970s to set up a shop stewards-based accountable structure within the union, which was a huge development, heavily influenced by the time of the Institute for Workers' Control and demands around that. Clive is right that the unions are often very big, become very bureaucratic, and any big organisation with a big bureaucracy, that bureaucracy tends to want to perpetuate itself more than anything else. That is a pressure that is inevitable in any big organisation. But as I was pointing out, the employment structures have now so radically changed that union representation has to change with them. And the point Clive made about refugees in the Channel and the lack of statements on that, you're right, because unions have got to become social unions. Hence the membership, the community membership activities in Unite are, I think, extremely welcome. The unemployed members unions are also very important. The retired members section is very important. When we join a union, it ought to be that we're joining part of our community organisation and community life. And so it isn't just something that's focused solely on the workplace, but so focused on the social conditions. I mean, if you're a member of Unison, your concerns, and you're working in the NHS, your concerns are obviously about funding the NHS and how the NHS operates, obviously. But your concerns are also about, can you afford to live anywhere near the hospital where you work? Your concerns are also about, if you've got children, their education and so on. And you want your union to be part of the pressure on all those things. And speaking out on issues like refugees in the Channel, we've all got to speak out on that, because these are human beings that are dying on our very doorstep because of the racist pressure against people who predominantly are victims of war, human rights abuse, and environmental degradation and disaster. And if people are going to talk about numbers of refugees in Britain, as the Daily Mail and Daily Express do every single day, I just remind them that at this very moment, Bangladesh is hosting 1 million Rohingya refugees from a very poor country with a very limited economy compared to anything in Western Europe. And our solidarity goes out to the Rohingya just as much as it goes out to any other person seeking safety and asylum anywhere in the world.
This is got to be about the easiest panel I've ever chaired.
You can't get a look in, Jamie. Come on, tell us what you think.
You could just close the conversation. Round up at the end, Jamie.
Everyone
So indisciplined, that's the problem.
All three of us are prepared to let you speak.
To what extent do we really need to make a major effort on showing an alternative vision of society? And I don't just mean the old-fashioned, still relevant as they are, economic arguments about it. I remember you and I, Jeremy, talking just last year about the need for a society that wasn't based on this idea of individual competitiveness, about social solidarity. Is it a major priority for us to talk about a different vision of society so people see it in a coherent alternative, as opposed to, yes, we need more police on the streets, yes, we need to tackle homelessness, things that are very easy for any other politician to say, I agree with that, but not do.
Well, John started this with the economic conferences he held all over the country. The Green New Deal work that Becky was doing, much the same. And I attended quite a lot of Green Industrial Revolution groups in different towns. I remember a very interesting one in Macclesfield. It's a place that I would hope one day we're going to win, but we didn't. But nevertheless, it has a strong and vibrant environmental and labour movement in the town, all of whom turned up for a discussion about how to make the place more environmentally sustainable and to create jobs, so that we're not threatening people in work with our environmental policies. Instead, we're building on their concerns in order to build a greener future. And we're a brilliant one in Blackpool and other places. And that surely is what we should be doing now, is bringing people together through unions, trades council, Labour Party, community, and so on a vision for their community and their town. There's thousands, tens of thousands of people all over the country who volunteered to help during the corona crisis. They are people, and in my experience, who never expected that they'd ever be hard up, never expected they'd have to apply for universal credit, never expected they'd need a food bank, and now are working away in the community, supporting people who are going through real crises at the present time. And that experience is changing their approach and changing their attitude and changing their outlook. And I think that is a kernel and a strength for the future. Those people will never forget the experience of 2020, when they had to do their best to support people in a very vulnerable situation in their communities, and emerged as a stronger community as a result of it. And all the failings of underfunding of public services have been exposed in the past 6 months.
Can I just come off the back of that, Jeremy? Because I agree with Jeremy about obviously working with John on the team and looking at this issue, sustainable economics. I think the Green New Deal will possibly become the biggest strategic issue for the left once the pandemic is over. And I'll explain Absolutely. Why I think it is. I think it has the possibility of becoming our next Brexit. And I'll explain myself here. I think increasingly you're going to see an increasing number of middle-class people in this country who are and will become increasingly concerned over the political class's failure to effectively tackle the climate and ecological crisis. Basically, anyone that has enough material wealth in society, a stake in society, to worry about it. On the other side of that, you will find an increasingly authoritarian populist right who will basically be playing jobs against climate. And they will be saying, after the pandemic, in a recession with mass unemployment, they will be saying that these middle-class liberal elites want to cost you jobs by decarbonizing and their hippie sandal-wearing vegetarianism. We will provide jobs, but we will be saying screw the ecology because it's jobs first. And they will drive a wedge between those who have so little and who are often poorly educated and who will see the climate as something happening to other people or something that isn't of concern to them. What will be of concern to them will be jobs now. And it doesn't make a difference what those jobs are, whether they're in the airline industry, what's left of it, whether they're in polluting jobs, whether they're in jobs which are unsustainable, in simply more consumption and so on and so forth. And that is what the right are going to do. They're going to drive a wedge, like they did on Brexit, between that constituency that we as a Labour Party need to win in 2024, the red wall, so to speak. And this is where the big fight will come, I think, on the Green New Deal. And I think this is where the left and community organising can come into its own. And Jeremy was picking up before, we need to be in those communities saying to them that there is not incompatible to tackle the climate crisis in a globally equitable way and provide sustainable jobs for you and your community. But we are going to have that communication with them directly, because the mainstream media will not allow that to happen.
It's happening already. If you look at what's happening in aviation, Clive's right. If you look at what's happening in aviation, I've got Heathrow in my constituency. I've got BA laying off not just the 10,000 redundancies, they're laying off everybody and then taking them back on reduced wages and undermining their working conditions in terms of employment. And the argument is that this is the only way that they'll maintain any form of job, and therefore they'll be arguing for another third runway at Heathrow, which will be cataclysmic in terms of climate change. But
Les Bowman just put a very good point up from Blythe Valley about exactly that, and the number of jobs that are being created in green energy and so
exactly.
on. And that is huge, and that was exactly what we were. I agree with and recognise everything Clive's saying about the dangers. We have to be realistic about those dangers, but it's also about saying to people that actually a sustainable future is better for all of us. It's no good complaining about air pollution in our cities and foul smoke that our kids are breathing and all the rest of it if we don't do something about it and be seen to be doing something about it, and also pointing out that a green future is a more equitable one, and that the green industrial revolution will be a far more equitable one than any of the previous industrial revolutions. I think, you know, there's huge opportunities here, but obviously you've got to bring people together and unite them on it. And we've all been through what can be very difficult conversations in your communities about traffic calming and planning, about changes of energy supply and all that sort of thing. But we've got to do that. That's what we're here for.
Absolutely.
It's not rocket science, though, is it? It's what we were trying to do. We were touring. My treasury team, Clive was part of it. Every other Saturday, we were touring round, convening local community conferences to talk about the local economy. And the idea behind that was not to say, here's our policies, this is what we're going to do to you. It was saying, tell us about your local economy. Here's a menu of policies we've been looking at. What do you think? Would they work here? But what are your ideas? And what we wanted to do, and this is really what frustrated us all about the community organising recruitment, what we wanted to do is use that as the basis of the start of an exercise in every local community of bringing people together, so they saw the material benefits immediately of what our policies were, but more importantly, that they were involved in designing that local economic strategy that would produce those benefits. And it's interesting, on every one we did, the response was always around issues related to the Green New Deal and how quickly we could get that into place, because people recognise that the environmental dirty jobs were ones that were the most at risk. The problem, and this is the frustration of it all really, and Jamie knows this more than anyone, is that the Labour Party bureaucracy, we weren't in control of it for 2 years, and for 2.5 years, they blocked the recruitment of the community organisers. And I say this, and if I sound bitter, I bloody well am. They blocked for 2 years my appointment of my economic advisor. That's how bad it was. We didn't display much of this publicly at the time because we just had to get on with the job.
I remember.
That was the intention, to try and roll out these discussions about local economies and jobs, start working, and it was a bit going back to Mike Cooley and the alternative economic plans, etc. Have alternative economic plans developed by local communities, backed up by the resourcing from the Labour Party, working with trade unions as well. And I think that is the way forward, that deep community organising. That the Labour Party was formed because we were at the heart of local communities. It was formed at the local level and then evolved into a national party. And that's what we've got to return to, that sort of structure. But it needs resourcing, and that's going to be the battle in this coming period, because the bureaucracy in the Labour Party always resented community organising because it lost control. It would move control back to members and back to community.
I would love to continue this all day, and I'm sure everybody else would. We've reached the end of our time, but it's a great opportunity, I think, to segue the North of Tyne. We've got our Citizens Assembly on climate change. We've put more than a year's worth of our budget into a Green New Deal, including transitioning workers and a whole range of other things that we're on.
Organise another one in reality in Newcastle or somewhere in the northeast, not too far in the future, because this has been a really interesting and really good discussion. And I think from what I've seen on the chat box, there's been some great contributions there, and I think we could make an awful lot more of this, and I'd love to be part of it if you would wish me to be.
Well, we'll have a think about that, Jeremy.